I am really delighted to introduce Dr. David Wang to all of you. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of his presentation, which is going to be really interactive. As you can tell, there is a giant whiteboard in here. So we're going to use Slido to submit, which is something that we used last time. So you're going to go to slido.com, and then you're going to punch in a number, which, oh, there it is right there. And then you're going to just submit your question in there. So if there's something that pops up, feel free to jot it down in one of our fancy little checkbook-looking like notebooks with our AACC pens. Or you can, jot it down there and then to remind yourself to text it here. Or you can do it directly on slido.com. Make sure you put in that hashtag number, 204-3963, and that'll lead you to the one that we're using. All right. Dr. David Wang is the pastor of spiritual formation at One Life City Church in Fullerton. He's also a licensed psychologist and the Cliff and Joyce Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders, and also an associate professor of psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. But along with his many titles and accolades, he is also a Disney lover, which I discovered. He loves Disneyland too, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Indeed.
You have annual passes? Yeah. Who doesn't love Disney, right? So without any further ado, please welcome warmly Dr. Wang for his talk, Emerging from COVID-19 Pandemic, Mental Health and Resilience for Children, Teens, and Adults. Dr. David.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to be with you all this morning. Thank you for waking up so early on a Saturday morning, no less. I know this might be the one day of the week where we get to sleep in because tomorrow's church. Though, to be fair, since many of you have families, you probably never get to sleep in anyway, so you might as well be here. And in addition to all those different roles that I've held or hold, there's an additional one. I used to be a software engineer. That was kind of my parents' idea. I didn't have much of a choice when I went to college. And the way I rebelled was I took a second major in social work, and that ended up kind of blossoming into me eventually studying to become a psychologist. And I think to this day, my parents don't quite understand what I'm doing still, but I still love them and, hold lots of different kinds of tensions. And this past year, I took on this new role at Fuller Theological Seminary, and this title is a mouthful. It's called the Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders. And as far as I can tell, this is kind of, I don't know of many other roles in the theological education world that focuses on that, and I'm really excited to be part of this. And the idea behind this role at Fuller is I'm helping them rethink what theological education might look like if we were to take seriously the emotional formation of pastors and future Christian leaders, just as seriously as intellectual formation and just as seriously as spiritual formation, right? And there's a reason why we need to take these things seriously, because there's a bunch of research, and this might be for a different occasion, that speaks of how challenging ministry is, not just intellectually and not just spiritually, but emotionally for pastors and Christian leaders. And I feel like this is even more so during these last several years, during COVID, as people are acting out of different forms of political polarization, stress, lockdown, and it is often the pastor that is the first person who gets called in when some sort of crisis happens in the community. And it's also the pastor that is oftentimes absorbing a lot of this stuff that's going on as people are understandably very much distressed. So I might sprinkle in some of that research as well throughout today. But today, I'm super excited about talking a little bit more about what challenges, as far as it relates to mental health and Asian American families, what kind of challenges we're facing throughout this season of COVID. I don't get to speak specifically to the Asian American context, so that's a really big treat. And I'm going to build in several moments for you to interact with one another, and I would love to hear your feedback and your thoughts and your conversations as well, so be prepared for that. But just as as a way of kind of giving you a broad sense of some of the general mental health implications of COVID on our population here in America. Between 2019, right before COVID, and 2020, kind of towards the first half of COVID, research has found and observed an 8,000% increase in suicide hotline usage. 8,000% increase, right? And during quarantine and home isolation, we found that quarantine and home isolation was associated with things like anxiety, loneliness, insomnia, decreased concentration, anger, and irritability. And I think when we think of these things, we oftentimes will first gravitate towards our children because a lot of them struggled during school during this season. But I would suggest that these symptoms were present just as much among adults as well, although it might take different kinds of different forms, right? I've also heard that, and I've seen this in my clinical practice in my church, that COVID almost was like a magnifying glass in our families, right? Whereas, in the past, if there were vulnerabilities or conflicts in the family, at least the children had school, at least the parents had work, and we had different places to go to kind of buffer us from whatever might be going on in the family. But during COVID lockdowns, we didn't have those resources and buffers and communities anymore. So whatever conflict was there and whatever tension was there, it got magnified, and we were there. We had to, whether we liked it or not, we had to deal with it 24/7 a day. And oftentimes that led to things like the final point, which is, sadly, during COVID, we saw a dramatic increase in domestic violence calls, in child custody cases, as well as serious family disputes year over year. And this also, unfortunately, led to increased not just parental stress, but also child abuse and neglect. And there's other statistics there, but we don't have time to go into that yet. The other thing I wanted to highlight about the research on COVID is that the closest thing that we can compare COVID to, and for sure COVID is unprecedented, but the closest thing we can compare it to is the SARS pandemic in southern China, if you guys remember that a couple decades ago. And research from the SARS pandemic suggested that 44% of SARS survivors actually went on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And among those individuals, a vast majority, 82% of them, actually continued to have post-traumatic stress symptoms several years later. So, and I think many of you guys already have this sense, but what this suggests is that even though the lockdowns and, Lord willing, the worst of COVID is now over, it doesn't mean that all the challenges and struggles and symptoms of COVID is going to just magically disappear. There's something about trauma that is stubbornly persisting, right? It persists over time in our life history, and if we have an opportunity, looking forward to even exploring what it looks like in your family, not just in your current, this current generation of your family, but also previous generations of your family history. Because trauma also gets passed down intergenerationally. It's carried in all of our cultures, not just Asian cultures, all cultures around the world. But every unique culture has its own, I would suggest, unique trauma, intergenerational trauma footprint. So let me bring this closer to home as far as pastors and religious leaders. So one of the research studies that I oversee is this large-scale longitudinal study with 18 different North American seminaries, 1,500 seminary students. Many of them are already pastors. And we took a mental health snapshot of our seminary pastor sample back in fall of 2020. And this is what we found. We used research-grade validated mental health outcome measures, and we found that over half reported clinically significant depression in the middle of COVID. These are our church leaders. 43% reported clinically significant anxiety symptoms. And then we also collected some data on trauma, and we found that 43% reported some sort of traumatic event in their lifetime. We actually believe this is an underreported statistic because other research have pointed to much higher prevalence rates, closer into the 70 to 80% range. But what also stuck out in this data is the last point, which was 33% of our seminarian sample endorsed a sufficiently high number of PTSD symptoms to potentially be warranted for a full diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder in the middle of COVID. So, we did a PTSD screener, and if they took this screener in a mental health hospital, that would have triggered an automatic psychiatric referral for a full psychiatric assessment for post-traumatic stress symptoms. So this is the degree of the severity of mental health challenges that we're talking about during these last 4 or 5 years or so. So with a few people next to you, and perhaps you might have to, I know the situation's different now for many of us, but perhaps we might need to think a little bit backwards. Think back into 2020, especially the latter part of 2020, maybe early 2021, when we're still in the lockdowns. I'd like for you to reflect and then discuss with maybe a friend, 1 or 2 friends next to you. What were some of the symptoms that you've observed in your children, in your colleagues, or even in yourself during the height of COVID? So for example, just to illustrate, I know I started to feel overwhelmed maybe around the fall of 2020, and one of my symptoms was I just wanted to check out and watch Netflix and YouTube all the time. And I still do that. I watch those short TikTok videos a lot, and I waste way too much time doing that kind of thing. But this was kind of on another level where I just needed to veg out and check out from the world, and I did that a lot more than I usually did. COVID was a season of loss. It was not just the loss of concrete things like jobs and people and sports, but it's also a loss of symbolic things like our sense of safety, our plans, our sense of what the future holds, stuff like that. And whenever there's loss, there's also grief. And we all grieve differently. And one way to potentially look at these symptoms is that they could be symptoms of grief, all of this stuff. What do we do with such a diverse list of symptoms? One of the things I'd like to do with you is to kind of make sense of all of this, possibly. And I want to give you a few lenses, a few frameworks to potentially kind of get a sense and get a whole grapple of like how and why are these symptoms happening. And I think there's 2 frameworks that might be helpful. The first framework is to maybe look at this notion of grief and loss and how many of these symptoms, maybe not all, but I would actually suggest many or most or almost all, can potentially be symptoms of grief, right? Because as you all know, there's, Kubler-Ross talks about the 5 stages of grief. There's denial, there's bargaining. Bargaining, what I saw during COVID, had a lot to do with self-blame. Like, I should have done this, I should have done that. Then maybe my kids wouldn't have to struggle like this. A little more silent and more implicit, but that's actually bargaining phase of grief. There's also depression and sadness. There's also anger, and then there's also acceptance. And I think between those 5 themes, that covers quite a lot of these symptoms. And something very much related to grief and loss that I would suggest might actually capture most or not all is trauma. These are all symptoms of trauma. So you might have probably learned this in biology 101, but when humans encounter some sort of crisis experience, oftentimes it will activate what scientists call the flight and fight response. But we've also learned in more recent years and decades that there's actually a third response too. There's fight, flight, and freeze. And I actually feel like most of this would readily categorize into one of these three responses. So what would be an example of a flight response in the age of COVID? So as you know, a flight response is when we want to run away from our threat or relocate ourselves physically from a threat or avoid a threat in any way possible. But you can't really do that with COVID because COVID's everywhere and you can't really see it, and you don't know if it's on a doorknob or whatever. So you can't physically run away from COVID, but you can mentally check out from COVID. So when we talk about feeling overwhelmed and vegging out, the clinical term for vegging out is dissociation. And dissociation is a trauma response. Most actually commonly among relational trauma and sexual trauma, when someone's overpowered and they can't physically get out. When trauma happens in the home in childhood and it's not like you can leave the house, when the threats are actually in the home, that's when we tend to dissociate because we can't get out of home. So the best we can do is we mentally check out. Right? And this is a natural human response to prolonged significant stress. The second response pattern is a fight response, right? So what would be an example of a fight response during COVID? It's when people get irritable and angry and they start acting out. Sometimes we'll see this in young boys when they start getting a little bit more, aggressive physically, and that's probably the most obvious sign. But other people act out in different ways. And one of the ways that we actually act out of the fight response, I would suggest, is a lot of us parents, we went into over-control, micromanaging mode, right? We went into hypervigilance, hyper-alert mode because we want to tackle this head on. But then how do you actually tackle this head on for such a long time when you don't actually, and how do you know when it's actually finally safe? That's all potentially part of the fight response. An angry outburst, so when we can't control the situation, sometimes that's actually the beginning of a conflict, right? And then there's the freeze response, when we're so overwhelmed that we can't mobilize ourselves to do anything. And the only thing that we can do is just kind of veg out and hide from the world. And perhaps in a more severe case, I'm wondering if you guys have encountered in your workplace colleagues in your workplace that just couldn't show up to work anymore, or just couldn't function in their function. And this is unusual because they're usually very dependable, very loyal, very on top of things, but then sometime during COVID, they just checked out and couldn't mobilize their internal energy to get up and do their work. That's actually the freeze response. I'll be sharing my slides. I know this is really, really small, so pardon that. I should have changed the font on this. But there is this chart, and I'm happy to share the slides with you all afterwards. But this gives you an idea from kind of, on this column here. This is age range, and this is 0 to 5, 6 to 12, 13 to 21. And this talks about kind of not age appropriate, but developmentally common responses to trauma. Where with the younger folks, the younger children, oftentimes they will react out of trauma in the form of developmental delays. So if you had young children and they kind of regressed, where they were already potty trained for a while and then all of a sudden they weren't anymore, That's a potential sign of trauma. In adolescence, you have academic delays, problems with social skills, extreme emotional swings, and when you get older, you get challenges related to planning for the future, so on and so forth. So feel free to consult this, this table if you're interested in that a little bit more. Any questions so far? And if not, that's okay. But I just wanted to make a little space in case. Yes? Sorry? We're working on it. We are working on it. In fact, that will be the second half of our time together. So let me share with you a formal definition from the DSM-5 of what a traumatic event is. A traumatic event is characterized by the following: when a person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury or a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. In the past, there was also this additional kind of criterion for a traumatic event, which reads, and the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, and horror. We actually took that out of the DSM because we realized that different people respond to trauma differently. Some people do carry this kind of helplessness and horror response, whereas other people, especially those with the freeze response, actually don't demonstrate much of a response at all. But both individuals are equally traumatized. So the next question I have for you to discuss with a few people next to you is the following. In what ways does trauma make its presence felt throughout COVID and presently within the context of Asian American families? And then looking at things more historically and intergenerationally, in what ways does historical and intergenerational trauma also make its presence felt in the context of Asian American families today? So to give you one possibility, like for my own family, my grandfather on my dad's side immigrated. My dad immigrated from Taiwan, and my grandfather on my dad's side was a general for Chiang Kai-shek. So he fled the Cultural Revolution into Taiwan. And I didn't learn until I was a clinical psychologist that my grandfather had PTSD. He woke up at night screaming because he had regular nightmares of being on the battlefield. And that shaped the way he parented my dad. And that shaped how my dad parented me, even though I lived 60 to 80 years after the war on the other side of the earth, you know? And also, we had some family assumptions and habits, like, you know, we never use the dishwasher, we have to put saran wrap around like the, you know, remotes, we kind of hoard a little bit, you know, and we never throw things away, you know, and, you know, stuff like that. And I started to realize that a lot of that actually is shaped by trauma, because just a few generations ago, there wasn't enough for everybody. And that's why there's a reluctancy in a lot of the older generations to get rid of stuff. Like the Marie Kondo stuff would not make sense in the context of World War II and the Korean War, right? And the Vietnam War. Discuss. We could end it here. We could end it here. Okay. Okay, let's come back together. So just wanted to, I know there's actually, we can totally do this all day because I have another half of the lecture of this, and I have like 2 or 3 other lectures I have a feeling that we'd really be interested in talking through. But from here, I do want to start to land the plane and transition to Q&A time. But before that, I just wanted to share a few closing thoughts. The first is that, what I was sharing about how a lot of times our parents weren't the best role models on how to hold pain and how to create a relational home for things like that. I feel like that, when I think of things intergenerationally, I'm guessing my granddad probably wasn't that for my parents either, and so on and so forth. I think that is a real challenge for all of us here, and I think we're in a really difficult spot because we're being asked to do it for our kids, but no one actually taught us how to do it ourselves, and chances are, with our parents, or if they're still alive, it's still not a safe place emotionally, and it's still going on. And I want to encourage you guys to press into this because I think this is something that's worthwhile. It's going to be difficult, and we're going to have to learn from scratch. But if we do it together, and if we do it together in our church community, I think I'm very hopeful we can pull this off. And one last point from the research on trauma. One of the bright spots of research on trauma is it talks about, it's mixed. It talks about the power of social support being one of the most powerful predictors of either recovery and healing or re-traumatization and kind of a negative spiral. Because social support can be positive, where it makes us feel held and loved and seen, and social support can also be negative, where it makes us feel judged and so forth. And in fact, one research study found that social support, or the lack thereof, it actually predicted post-traumatic stress disorder even more powerfully than prior trauma history, prior mental illness, and even the severity of the trauma itself. Isn't that interesting? So in some ways, it's more important how your primary social support network, however you might define it doesn't have to be biological family, by the way, how they respond to your pain and to the extent to which they can hold it, that actually has more implications on your recovery process than what actually happened in the original event. That's how powerful social support is. And what I want to leave you with, and if we had more time, we'd discuss this a little bit more. And you're welcome to have all these slides. I want you to think critically about some of these commonly shared phrases from churches, because I hear it all the time. Personally, I also get this indirectly from my clients that I see in my private practice. These are, perhaps arguably they're theologically correct, but they are not a very good relational home for pain. Don't feel bad. It was part of God's plan. It's God's will. God intended this for your own good. You should be grateful. At least you still have this. The victory is already yours. Easter Sunday is actually one of the toughest Sundays for trauma survivors. It could be worse. Everything will be okay, and I've heard this, unfortunately. Maybe it's because you're in sin and you made poor choices. Maybe you weren't careful enough. Maybe you should have watched what you wore, Well, if you change, fill in the blank, then your problem will be resolved. So these are very common statements, and I would love for you to reflect on what would be things that you can say, postures that you can hold, that are just as true to the Christian faith, but actually create space for you to hold somebody's pain. And for you to do that for each other as adults, and just as importantly, for us to do this in a developmentally appropriate way with our children.
Okay, Dr. David, are you ready?
Yeah.
Here we go. Actually, this question, and I wanted to really ask this also because you're talking about those phrases that we use a lot and about how we hold someone's pain. I know that in the Bible, there's a lot of examples of lament, like from the Psalms and things like that. But it feels weird to me to quote, like, Psalms when someone's going through a hard time. Like, they're just like, hey, my dog died. And I'm like, cry out to the Lord. Why are you bashing against the rock? Like, that's weird. So, and this, I feel like this person understands me. Can you give some examples of not just phrases, but how do you hold someone's pain? When someone comes to you or your kid comes to you, especially when your kid comes to you, how do you hold that pain for them? What are some of those alternative phrases that we can use?
Yeah. So great question. And especially with children, but I think this is equally true for adults. I think the first thing I would suggest is if you don't know what to say, and a lot of times, like, we're stumped. It's really hard to have anything to say. It's okay to not say anything. In fact, it might actually be the most appropriate thing to do. And if you can convey with your nonverbals that you're there with them, that you're also feeling what they're feeling. And with children, it's important to crouch down at their level, and give them eye contact. And I think, maybe this might be a different topic or question, but I do find that a lot of Asian Americans have this habit of smiling when they're feeling negative emotions. I do it too, and some of that might come from a place of, like, I feel a sense of shame that I'm feeling this, so I'm trying to kind of put up like a certain kind of front. But with shame, the antidote of shame is to share it and to connect with somebody else. So in your nonverbals, not only if you're looking at giving them eye contact, not in a freaky kind of way where you're like, doing like that, but if you can also subtly move closer to them, I think actually that conveys a lot, where it's like, I'm sharing this and people aren't distancing themselves from me. They're not thinking that I'm like weird or something wrong with me. In fact, they're not only taking me seriously, but they're actually coming closer to me. And the reality is that when you do share your pain with someone and you take that risk, you actually are giving them, in many cases, a gift, because you're giving them an opportunity to actually get to know you even better and to be even more intimate with you. So we can reciprocate by doing so. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, all right. So then, let's say you're doing this to your kid, and you're saying the right things that you're supposed to say. What if your kid just says, "You're just saying that because you're my dad or you're my mom"? I get that a lot, and this person gets that a lot too. How do you respond to that?
Well, in my case, I say, well, actually, I don't. I said this to my client last week. That's not very helpful, though, too. But so from there, there's lots of different directions that you can go. One of the places that I start with, and especially if this is true, is I'll say something like, I'm saying this because Dad feels the same thing. So one example of this is my older daughter, Lydia, who's 16 now. When she was 7 or 8, she's a feeler, and she would always act up. She loves having guests over, especially people who, spend a few nights and you get to hang out. Like, she loves having people over. She doesn't necessarily need to talk to you, but just having you in the room, in the house, it makes her really, really happy. And she would always act up in the closing hours right before they're leaving, because this is grief and loss. And she loves having people over, and this is, she won't be able to do that again. And one of the times I remember when she was 8 and she was getting really upset, we talked about this, and we said, you know what? Daddy gets sad when people leave too. And you know what? I love how much you love having people around. That is a value I can get behind, and that's a value I can share. And it's okay for you to feel sad. And one of the ways that we will respond to this sadness is let's schedule a time so that we know they're going to come again. And then we can count the days between now and then. And that is so much different to what I was used to, which is, why are you acting up? You're being a bad son. You're being too sensitive, blah, 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 blah. And instead, you're actually affirming the goodness of what's actually going on, the value. You're stating it out loud, and you're actually giving them concrete coping tools. So you're naming it, and you're actually equipping them with tools on how to navigate their inner landscape.
Yeah, I love that, because it's not like, just deal with it, or just dismissing it. I think that affirmation is a huge, huge thing.
Right. I mean, I think most of us got messages like that. Hey, calm down, right? Well, I don't know how to calm down, How do I just... It's like throwing someone into a swimming pool who doesn't know how to swim and go, swim. That's the equivalent of what most of us grew up with in terms of emotional coping and regulation. No one actually taught us these things, but we're instructed to just magically do them.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask this other question first, and then there's kind of a follow-up for this, but have there been studies on what trauma looks like over time? Because if older generations were able to live a good life, are we better off focusing on trauma? I don't know if that makes sense.
Good question. I would suggest that older generations, there are many that have worked through their trauma and have lived those lives. And I would also suggest that many of them are a little bit better at hiding it. So for example, I used to work at the Veterans Hospital in Houston, Texas, and I did a lot of PTSD units and did a lot of PTSD work. And one of the patterns that we observed was that we got a whole influx of Vietnam War veterans right around the 2010s, late 2000s, early 2010s. And we're going, hey, this is a war that happened several decades ago. Why is everyone coming in for PTSD treatment and being diagnosed for PTSD for the first time? And someone did research on it, and we realized that what's going on is that these people actually had PTSD the whole time, but they numbed away their emotions by becoming workaholics. And once they reached retiring age, they couldn't numb it away by overworking anymore, and then lo and behold, the symptoms came out. And I would suggest that a lot of people in ministry actually numb away their trauma and PTSD by doing ministry and overworking. And unfortunately, we have cultures and churches that kind of positively reinforce overwork, and that may not give us space to actually do the work that we need to do.
Yeah, and I think about our parents' generation, or like my parents' generation, when they immigrated. I mean, they were working really hard, so they didn't have space or time, I feel like, to even address any of the trauma that they may have experienced. And same with my grandma. So we have this luxury now that we can kind of wrestle with it and deal with it. And so in follow-up, in your practice, what are some of the best tips, maybe like top 3 tips for being a good home for trauma?
I think the first one is, can I accompany, can a family accompany each other in their pain? And I think the first step to that is not trying to fix it immediately. I think, a good starting point is just, recognizing those sorts of pain that is probably going to last for a long time, if not the rest of our lives, like family stuff. Stuff like that doesn't go away, even after they pass away, And to acknowledge, like, hey, this is probably going to last a while. We might be talking about this next year again. We might be talking about this 10 years from now, and that's okay. That's normal. So kind of taking away this idea of, oh, you're still struggling with that? Like, I thought you did this already. And to realize that most of us actually carry this for the rest of our life, and that's okay. The second thing I would suggest, if we want to bring Jesus into this, Jesus died on the cross. That's a trauma. And guess what? We don't forget that trauma. Even though Jesus resurrected from the grave and conquered sin and death, there's still signs and scars from the trauma. Remember when he talked to doubting Thomas? Jesus still had his scars on his hand. It didn't magically disappear. In the book of Revelation, when we all see Jesus face to face in this, in the glorious kind of, cloud of witnesses, we still call Jesus the Lamb that was slain. We don't forget these things, and that's okay, right? Jesus doesn't even forget his trauma. And that's where, and maybe that leads to the third idea, where, if we grieve our traumas, and we do the hard work of doing it, oftentimes our hearts actually enlarge. That's one of the potentially positive outcomes of good grief, is it actually enlarges our hearts in such a way where we can actually walk with and accompany somebody else's hurt, because we've done that in our own life with our own hurts.
Yeah, that was good. I think about that all the time whenever we do communion and we say kind of those words about how...
And communion's supposed to be about holding hurt.
Yeah, and
That's
remembering, great. Right? Remembering that this was my body that was given for you, and then we break that bread. Yes. And then the wine, or the grape juice, I guess, to remind us of the blood that was spilled. Yeah. And so I think about that a lot when we're doing communion, and especially when we try to communicate that to the children, that remembering this is an important thing, but it's a sign, it gives us the sign for the hope that we have, because Jesus overcame those things. So thank you for pointing that out.
And even in overcoming, he doesn't forget. And I think that also is a good segue into, I talk a lot about, even in my clinical practice with Christians, I don't proselytize in my therapy room because we're not supposed to, but I talk a lot about the doctrine of incarnation. Have you guys ever wondered, out of all the ways that God could have accomplished, the redemption of humankind, for whatever reason, he chose the most painful way possible, of coming down to earth, being born in the manger, and being crucified, probably the most horrific trauma possible. And that's the pathway that God chose to redeem humankind. And I think that reflects certain values of God, because theoretically, God can do anything. He could have just waved his magic wand and stayed in heaven and found a way to redeem us, but instead he chose the painful way. He also chose the incarnate and relational way. And in doing so, like it says in the book of Hebrews, therefore we don't have a high priest that can't relate to our struggles and pain here, but he has been tempted in every way, and yet he is without sin. So this idea of inviting Christ to come alongside your pain, inviting Christ to hold your pain, to pray those kinds of prayers. And we can do that in confidence because we actually worship a God who knows exactly what it's like to suffer pain here on this broken earth.
Yeah, and that's why we can hold others' pains because of that, because Jesus has done that for us. All right, one last question as we wrap up this time. And this question is something that's been on my heart recently, because we, at my kids' school, my 13-year-old kids' school, we just started a BIPOC student meetup.
Oh, great.
And as we were in discussion, these students, who are students of color, were sharing with me of all the different ways throughout the school day that there are racial slurs that are said to them. And they happen to all be Asian students, but some hate and some microaggressions and all those kinds of things. I was shocked, because I think when you talk to the teachers, they're not aware of it, but that's, being a teacher is a hard job, and you can't hear everything that they're saying. What is the best way to support our children when they deal with anti-Asians, hate, and racial slurs at school?
Great question. The research, which, to be fair, is mostly more grounded on the African American experience, but I, again, believe that this is true for Asian Americans as well, is that when it comes to racism in children, one of the most potent and robust kind of protective factors that parents can do is to socialize them, talk about it. And I'm very grateful for many of the things about my parents, and especially grateful that my dad actually talked to me about racism. I came home and shared with him about a painful experience related to my race when we lived in Colorado, and my dad said, that's really stupid. That's racist. And that actually led them to, within a year or two, he had a conversation with my mom. They said, we need to move to somewhere where it's more diverse. And then we moved to California, And for me to have that, he didn't teach me coping skills or anything, but just for him to like acknowledge it and validate it and not like put it on me, and then actually take steps to, that helped a ton, So I think one of the things we can do as parents is and share and talk about it with our kids so that they're not left alone to figure out what to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really, really important, because I think sometimes the kid will feel that they are the only ones that are going through that. And so even if they hear it from us as their parents, I think it's a huge thing. And then hearing it from other students, being like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one who's experiencing this. And this is wrong.
That's
this
right.
is not okay. So, well, thank you so much.